Our next question was, is trait theory of personality more reliable than type theory? This one I'm going to give to Rich.
Thank you. So this question is kind of a hard question to answer because I'm not exactly sure what is meant by more reliable. So I'm going to give a multi-point response. And it alludes back to some of the things that people have talked about already. So from a psychometric perspective or a measurement perspective, there's multiple forms of, quote, reliability. Typically, people use what we call internal consistency reliability, which is how well do the items hang together within a scale. And in this case, for a four-letter type, there's 4 scales. And then there's, test-retest reliability. So in other words, do you get the same results over time? We had that conversation before. And then there's the reliability of understanding. How well do you understand what the results mean? And John might jump in, maybe not, based on a paper that he and a former colleague of ours put together about different kinds of thinking about validity. But to answer each of those, at least by me, so internal consistency, reliability of the scales is good. On the global forms, for the 4 preferences, they're around 0.88 or 0.89. It varies slightly based on what country or language you took the assessment in. And so when people complain about it being not reliable, I don't think that's the one they're talking about. Typically, what they're talking about is the issue of test-retest reliability. And what that means is I took the assessment and I came out as an ISTJ. I took it again, I came out as an ISTP. So then they say, well, it's not reliable. The way that this has to be thought of is differently than how most other assessments report this kind of information. So when you look at the correlations between time 1 and time 2, correlations are very high for a scale. Meaning if I got an I before, wherever my score was on the EI measure, I'll get a very consistent score on EI the second time. Where type gets, or MBTI type gets kind of beat up, is they're looking at the 4 letters together rather than individual scale scores. And then we'll say, yes, it's somebody changed. Well, Keston's already talked about some of the reasons why people might change. Our experience is that, and we've looked at the data for this, is that people who are unclear or close to a cut point on one of the preferences, that's the one they're most likely to change on. Now, is that mindset? Is it they answered the question slightly differently because of something that's happened in their life recently? We don't know the answer to that, but we know that if someone's going to change on a preference, it's likely to be one where they're least clear. And then going back to what Keston talked about with the verification process, that's where you want to have a very deep discussion about that particular preference. We know also that when people are very clear, they don't change. You get, if you got E one time, you're going to get E again. So unlike other assessments, we're looking at this set of scores and calling that unreliable, whereas if you go back to a different personality assessment, they never look at a set of scores, they look at a single score. And so we're kind of held to a higher standard on type, and we know where people are likely to change. And then on the last bit about reliability of the information that's provided, or maybe usefulness of the information, John alluded to this before. I see the MBTI as a very simple model, very easy to understand, makes sense to people. When you explain, here's your preferences and here's how they combine into a whole type, it makes intuitive sense to most people. They understand it, and they can see that consistency with their own behavior. We've done some research on that consistency of their own behavior, and I believe Caitlin will share something we call the MBTI facts page, where we go into details on all of this. But what we see is people behave consistently with their 4-letter type more often than not, except for, we have to keep in mind that in any social situation, context can impose on you. So you might be an ISTJ, but at work you have to be some other type. Or you might, at some meeting or some situation where you can't express your full preferences. And that's another kind of complaint about reliability, is it says I do this, but I'm doing this in this other context. And you always have to take context into account for any kind of personality, application of personality to the real world. I think that's a long enough answer on that.
Can I just pick up on a couple of things that you talked about there, Rich? One is just to really reinforce what both you and Cass were saying, because to me, the MBTI isn't a test, isn't an assessment, isn't a questionnaire, it's a process. And that includes that whole piece of setting the scene in the first place for questionnaire, best fit interview, to really help the individual find out for themselves what type they are and how that works for them. And that was part of what myself and Penny Moore were talking about in our paper we were talking about. And I think the second thing that's useful to mention in terms of this question is when people say, oh, the MBTI isn't reliable, people change their type from one occasion to the other. If you look at the stats, as Rich said, what that typically means is those people who do change, they have changed one preference. Often the way it's presented by MBTI critics is as if the entire type has changed. And I think from the stats that happens about 1% or 2% of the time. That's a very unusual occurrence. So it's not about the whole type's change, it's more about, as Rich said, maybe one of those preferences people aren't sure about in terms of questionnaire results, although when it gets to that best fit interview, people find out their type, then people sort of know who they are.
Yeah, we have data on that change and how often 4 letters change. From the global research, precisely 0 people changed all 4 types in the success rate. So
there we go. Even better than I thought.
Sample of 17,000. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's a sample of about 3,000 people, if I remember correctly, on retest data. Yeah, it never happened on the global research.